Those of us over a certain age will remember 1989 for the massive changes in Eastern Europe with the breakup of the USSR and the ending of communism. And at that time there were big student-led protests against communist rule in China, with calls for democratic reform. There were 7 weeks of protest in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And after weeks of protest and failed attempts at negotiation, the government declared martial law, removed all of the foreign journalists from the square, and they sent troops in to clear Tiananmen Square. And on the 3rd and 4th of June, it's reported that up to 10,000 people were probably killed. Amidst the violence and the mayhem and the destruction of those days, the scenes were immortalised by a photo that a journalist got from a distance of one anonymous, unknown man who approaches a line of 17 tanks. He's alone, unarmed, clearly wearing civilian clothing. It looks from the photos like he's holding 2 carrier bags with his shopping in, and he's standing in front of this line of tanks. The tanks, for a time, are stationary. It's as if he's saying to them, "Thus far and no further, you shall not pass." After a while, he was arrested. No one knows what happened to him. It's believed he was killed. The photograph instantly went global. It became iconic. It captured these moments of protest and violence. The photo was known as Tank Man, also the unknown rebel. Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century, and yet no one really knows his name. I love the photograph. It is a very powerful image. You probably know it. And I often pass it out when I'm teaching on prayer and get some discussion growing with the group. How does this photograph remind you of prayer? It's interesting, the responses that people give. Clearly, this is one person standing up on his own against a whole system, against military might, standing up against injustice. You see the white painted lines in the road moving with the line of tanks. There's movement and power and force in the photo. It's dramatic, it's powerful. Some people say it reminds them of standing in the gap. And literally this man is standing in the gap between the tanks and the crowds of students behind him. He's a hero, an unknown hero. It reminds me of an article by David Wells. It's called Prayer, Rebellion Against the Status Quo. David Wells talks about the persistent widow in the parable who keeps going to the judge, crying out for justice until finally the judge hears her, recognises her persistence and acts on her behalf. He talks about prayer and the fact that Christians shouldn't simply resign themselves to the evil that we see around us. Prayer, he says, is rebellion against an evil world system. He says it's the absolute and undying refusal to accept as normal what is pervasively abnormal. I remember I was teaching in September of 2005 on a discipleship school in Arua in Uganda, and I used that photograph. I passed it out around the group. Several of the group had not seen the photo before, so it was very interesting, the responses people had, and we spent a long time talking about prayer. They'd all seen war themselves, firsthand, vividly. They knew what it was like to stand in hard situations. That afternoon I was exhausted. I'd been teaching. This was my second week of teaching, so I was tired. I needed some downtime, some space to introvert. I got on a bike and I cycled down into town. I found a quiet bar where I could have a Coke. There was a TV playing on the counter, and to my delight I saw that it was showing the cricket. It was actually the final day of the final match of England versus Australia in the Ashes. It was a 5-match series, each match 5 days long. England were 2-1 up. They were in bat on the final afternoon of the final day of the test. They had to draw this match to win the series, but they had to bat all afternoon. They were down to their final batsman. It was nerve-tingling. It was nervous. Everybody was chewing their fingernails in the match. And I watched with delight as Kevin Peterson scored his maiden Test century, 158 runs, and England slowly inched their way to a draw and to winning the series. It was probably one of the cricket matches of modern memory, especially amongst England fans. And I watched elated as England drew the game and won the series. It was kind of a culture shock watching this in a quiet bar in Uganda with everybody around, ignoring the cricket and watching this strange guy cheering to himself at the bar. But it was great fun. And over the days and weeks to come, this group of England cricketers became instant cultural heroes for the nation, sporting superstars. They received congratulatory memos from the Queen. They went on an open bus tour of London, the streets full of hundreds of thousands of people cheering their heroes. In the New Year's honours list, they were awarded MBEs. They were heroes, instant overnight millionaires. I returned from the cricket to a quiet YWAM base and spent the evening there on the base. As I walked in, I saw in the grounds there was a fire. I sat down beside the fire. There was a chap there called Daniel from the Sudan. That's not his real name. Daniel was married to Mary. I'd been intending to talk to Daniel for a while and not had the chance, so I sat beside him and asked him about his life story. I spent the next couple of hours hearing about Daniel and Mary's story, and it was an amazing and an inspiring story. Daniel and Mary had escaped the worst of Sudan's civil war. They'd been brought up in Egypt. They were well educated, they had degrees, they'd had well-paid jobs at a church in Cairo. But they both felt a strong call to pray for Sudan and ultimately to live in Sudan amongst their own people. And so they returned to southern Sudan at the turn of the millennium. They left the financial security and the peace of Egypt to return to what was essentially a war zone with a call to represent God there amongst their own people. The personal cost was immense. Shortly after returning, a fire swept through their property. Most of their personal possessions were destroyed in the fire. Especially in the first year or so that they were in Sudan, they didn't know many people. They didn't have a strong network of relationships, no family around them. They had little money. It was a struggle financially. They often went for times with little money and no food. Daniel told me about 2 weeks in particular when they had no food, and he watched as his children were almost starving to death. He talked about times when the whole family were ill with malaria, with no one to care for them. And even now, as I heard this story, and this was several years afterwards, his eyes were tearing up. These vivid, strong memories. He prayed and he pleaded with God to save them, to rescue them, but the pressure didn't ease up. And then Daniel told me that one day it's as if his eyes opened and he recognised how could he live and minister amongst a people unless he had suffered like them. He sensed that somehow, in a mysterious way, God was actually allowing them to pass through this season of suffering. And that through this, they would have their own personal story of suffering and of healing, provision, protection. And it was as if he needed to pass through this to really identify with and build relationship with the people of Sudan. As I heard this story, I was deeply moved. The personal cost, not simply to pray for the people of Sudan, but to stand in the gap, to move into the situation and to stand there. I returned to my room. I lay on my bed, it was quiet, I was journaling, and my mind was thinking back through the day. I was thinking about Daniel and Mary. I was thinking about the deliberate way they had felt not only called to pray for Sudan, but called to be there. The deliberate way they had counted the cost and were counting it daily. It was a costly calling. They were living out the message they believed in. They weren't simply praying from a distance. They entered into a nation suffering. Their lives were their message. This was incarnation. And as I listened to this story and thought about it, I recognised that Daniel and Mary weren't well known. Nobody knew their names. They were unknown heroes. They were unknown rebels. They were standing in the gap. They'd drawn a line in the sand and they were saying, thus far and no further, this is where we stand. And they were standing. As my mind flicked back through the day, I remembered the cricket. I remembered the pleasure I'd had in watching this. And I still love cricket. But I realised that my heroes, the heroes that my culture was holding up, were very different. They were instant celebrities. It's as if they received their reward in full now. They won fame. They won acclaim for hitting a cricket ball around. They did it well. They were known heroes. But their fame was passing, shooting stars. And I thought of Daniel and Mary and dozens of more people that I've met like them over the years who really are unnamed, unknown heroes standing in incredibly hard situations. And I know that there are thousands more of people like this who are living by a completely different standard. They're unknown rebels. We don't know their names. The writer to the Hebrews talks about people like this. The unnamed heroes of faith. And it tells us the world was not worthy of them. And as I lay there on my bed thinking about this, I was deeply challenged. This was an Ebenezer moment for me. Who were my heroes? Where do I place value? The heroes of a culture say a lot about the culture itself. Some of our heroes are good people. I still love cricket. But that fame is passing. Other heroes, these unknown rebels, they're not shooting stars. These are the stars that will shine for eternity one day when they receive their reward. They are the true heroes.